is a conference on mainly biology. I think this talk will probably have a larger effect, a bigger effect on linguists, because as you see by the title, I ask, is biolinguistics really business as usual? Because that's what even linguists who reject it or criticize it seem to think, and even people who call themselves biolinguists also think that sometimes. So I'll talk mainly about the field of biolinguistics, and I think when we talk about biolinguistics, it's always useful to reflect on its aims and on its methodological concerns and points in common with Evo-Devo in this case. And I think that exploring these aspects of the field will show how it is possible to bring biolinguistics within the field, within the fold of an extended synthesis in biology. Moreover, given that much confusion and misunderstanding, which I will not address specifically, but there is confusion and misunderstanding in biolinguistics, a positive side effect of this talk will be the clear demarcation of biolinguistics for most of the work that has been done in linguistics and still continues to be done in linguistics. So, well, this is what I was describing right now, so I'll skip it. So, Mueller 2008, in an attempt to dissipate some doubts about the conceptual distinctiveness of Evo-Devo, looks for answers to 3 questions about that field. He asks first if it has its own specific questions and research methods. He also asks if it solves biolinguistic problems that cannot be solved under other approaches. And he asks if it represents a significant change in the theoretical understanding of development and evolution. And I think that not only these questions are the right ones to ask about biolinguistics, but also the answers might show important connections between the two, Evo-Devo and biolinguistics, and help us understand better what biolinguistics is about. So first now I will talk about Evo-Devo and the extended syntheses. Even before Darwin, there were 2 major biological concerns. The first was how to explain the overwhelming variety and history of life forms in the planet. Species are so different among them that any relation between them seems hard to conceive just by looking at them. And the second was how to account for the fact that form and function seem to go hand in hand, even though by that time serious scientists have started to abandon the religious views that would suggest that an intelligent designer takes care of that. But even so, if we discard that, how can we explain that all species seem to be perfectly equipped for the tasks they have to carry out in order to survive? And even this goes from the way they look to the way they move to the way they take in the stimuli that are relevant for them. So these were 2 big concerns around the time that Darwin was starting to write his ideas. And he contributed some observations which will basically shape biology for years to come, and we could argue that they are still the principles that shape biology right now. And the observations he made, the 2 main ones, I'm simplifying it, but I think these are the 2 main ones, is that traits vary within populations and are inherited from one generation to the next one, although the exact mechanism for this was basically a mystery to Darwin. And certain members of a species will succumb to the environment, while others survive and prosper, and these are members of the same species. And the Darwinian principles that were derived from these observations were 2 very important ones. The first was descent with modification, and this explains variety. And natural selection explains the relation between form and function. So basically, Darwin had arrived at a theory of life forms. He was obviously ignorant of genes, so he could have not have said anything about them. So he had a theory of life forms. And these insights were incorporated, or rather some other insights were incorporated with these ones, in what came to be called the modern syntheses. And some of these new insights had to do with the rediscovery of Mendelian genetics, which had been largely ignored until then. developments in population genetics and its compatibility with a gradualistic, non-essentialist approach to species in their evolution, convergence of theory with empirical findings in fossil record. So the researchers that use fossils and more direct forms of empirical grounding of their findings were happy with the relation between evolution in these terms and evolution in geological terms. They were matching, so they were happy with it. And this led to genocentric modern syntheses, especially because of the first point here, that still dominates, it's still the dominating paradigm today. So I think that indeed for many people the modern synthesis seems to be the basis of all biology. We don't need to question it, and maybe for many people there's no reason to question it. But as research and reflection continued throughout the 20th century, it became apparent that some important elements had been left out of the modern synthesis. And Pilusi in 2007, and basically all his career has been about this, but recently has stressed some of these important elements that have been left out. And he mentions embryology and developmental biology, which are also things that had been forgotten in the time of Darwin. Especially embryology has literature that can be traced back before Darwin. Ecology, the omics, the so-called omics of biology, such as genomics, proteomics, and so on, and this gained force with more advanced knowledge of molecular structure, and phenotypic plasticity in epigenetics. And it is true that some of these, in retrospect, could not have been figured out at the time when the modern synthesis or when Darwinist thought was conceived, but nevertheless their emerging nature, their emerging importance tells us something that calls for something new, an extended synthesis. So much more is now known, as much more importance is given to factors external to the genes themselves, which were the central part of the modern synthesis. And while opinions vary as to what exactly should constitute an expansion into an extended synthesis, consensus exists on the need to accommodate new information and advancements. So even though many people will reject some of the things that some others want to include, I guess more or less everyone agrees that we need to add something to it. And there is also a need for new theoretical grounding, as being consistent with the modern syntheses is not at all the same as being part of the modern syntheses. And many people, when they are faced with new ideas, new insights, they'll say, well, but this is consistent with the modern syntheses. But it's not the same being consistent and being included in it. Because, well, modern synthesis is so simple compared to extended synthesis that most likely things will be consistent with it, but they're not part of it. And so the current landscape of the extended syntheses, when we compare it to Darwinism and later the modern syntheses, is a much larger picture. As you can see here, we have Darwinistic thought and the modern synthesis occupying just a fraction of everything that people pay attention to nowadays. And the one at the top there, Evo-Devo, is something that's very important nowadays and very important for biolinguistics, because it's at the core of the extended synthesis, the spirit of it, because it represents very clearly many things that were disregarded or unknown in the modern syntheses. Evo-Devo feels the need of taking the developmental processes of organisms into account, something that was indeed highly disregarded in the modern syntheses. It contrasts with the population-based view of evolution. So the individual evolves too, regardless of its species and the way this species evolves. And Evo-Devo seeks wide-ranging explanations for the evolution of different organisms. And this way, evolution can be viewed as subject to the same constraints that guide the development of individuals. And something that I think it's really important to biolinguistics, because it's a sin that linguists make very often, is that it lacks commitment to a specific theoretical persuasion. because as Benítez Burraco and Longa have said, any theory which reliably links evolution and development will be an Evo-Devo theory. Still, there are genocentric versions of Evo-Devo that Evelina also warned us about, and Antonio Benítez Burraco as well. And these sometimes have been the ones that have been given more importance in the language literature. So now if you look at biolinguistics, after looking at Evo-Devo, I'm sorry. I don't know if everyone here has heard of the term biolinguistics, but it has given origin to a lot of interest in activity in the last few years. And you can now find the term biolinguistics in handbooks, papers, conferences, the Biolinguistics Journal, and some research groups completely dedicated to this enterprise. And although it might seem like the latest buzzword, the fact is that it has been around since the 70s in an explicit way, but it refers to an enterprise that can be traced back actually to the mid-20th century, when a clear research program started by Noam Chomsky and Eric Lenneberg was emerging. And this program rested on a very simple and reasonable core assumption. That language is a distinctive biological property of Homo sapiens, and it can be studied as such. And this, I think, will be the only way of stating this in an uncontroversial fashion. This was the core idea, and the one that always has loomed throughout these years. And Chomsky and Lenneberg gave very different, or not very different, but different, but very much complementary contributions to the shaping of biolinguistic thought. So Noam Chomsky, while starting a tradition that came to be called generative linguistics, in which research on the structure and hierarchy of language held pride of place, he also single-handedly buried behaviorism with his review of B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior. Although despite this rejection of behaviorism being so devastating and virtually having no replies, yeah, okay. Although it didn't have a lot of replies and it was clearly devastating, if you look at psychology today, we will see behaviorist methods being used widely. And Eric Lenneberg, on the other hand, gave concrete research directions for the study of language as a biological property, as a biological organ. So he talked about things from facial muscles in their evolution to cognition. And Chomsky has over the years pursued the idea that language can be studied as a biological object. And if you look at all these papers, you see these questions coming up quite a bit. What constitutes linguistic competence in humans? How does this competence develop in the individual? How is this competence put to use? How is this competence implemented in brain structures? And how does it evolve in the human species? And as the century in the field of linguistics unfolded, these questions seemed either approachable by theoretical linguistics only, because they would always say we don't know much about the brain, so there's no real way of doing it otherwise, or they were a complete mystery, we have no idea how to answer them, or completely unanswerable, like we will never answer these questions. So as a result, we see a lot of biologically informed reasoning, but it seemed to remain largely a metaphor. People in every paper, they talk about the biological organ, but then they go on talking about linguistic structures and so on, and pronouns and clauses. But these questions remain the same. We still don't have any answers regarding this. But things are now changing. And one core idea is that biolinguistics is more than Chomsky. Having Chomsky as the chief representative of generative linguistics for decades has made it seem as though biolinguistics now had to follow the same path. But biolinguistics is not even a theory. It's any research direction that actively aims to unveil the biology of different components of language. And any theory who does this can be said to be biolinguistics. And another very salient departure from orthodox linguistics is interdisciplinarity. The more one realizes that language is not a monolithic object, and that each of the parts that might comprise it might even be in different levels of analysis, the more it seems that the only fruitful road to take is the interdisciplinary one. So biolinguistics, instead of keeping language in a temple like linguists do, is even more and more moving towards pluralism and collaboration. So we need different people with different backgrounds and perspectives, not groups of people who claim to know everything about language. So it's not uncommon to find linguists, biologists, psychologists, anthropologists, philosophers talking together nowadays about language. And another thing that is now starting to set biolinguistics apart is the importance given to the brain. So while it might be true that much remains to be discovered about the brain, like it's been claimed for years, it's also true that much more is known about the brain. And the faculty of language is uncontroversially attributed to the brain if we look at the species. And people for some time had the idea that it was our anatomy, but that's completely ruled out by now. So much debate is now going on about the specific properties of language in the brain, or particular properties of the brain that allow for language. And people have rooted for symmetry or globularity. There's different accounts on that. And then another big, seen as an advancement in biolinguistics, the discovery of the FOXP2 gene that has generated a lot of awareness about language and genes and the brain and the relation. Although it turns out that the importance of this gene is not as central as thought. It might be related more to articulate language than the faculty of language. And another factor that has very much propelled conceptual distinctiveness in biolinguistics is the shift of methodology in comparative psychology. So that's been a departure from an anthropocentric perspective. So now the approach to cognitive capacities is tending towards looking for points of commonality between humans and other species, which makes a lot of sense in evolutionary terms, because the practice so far had been to look for what makes us so special, so different. And a non-anthropocentric approach results in a bottom-up perspective, looking for basic underlying mechanisms in the animal kingdom, as opposed to looking for human cognitive capacities, such as language, in other species. So language is not monolithic, and it is reasonable to assume that at least some elements of whatever enters into it are spread throughout the animal kingdom. And, Lessons from Evo-Devo and the extended syntheses will help us shape biolinguistic research and thought, because it seems that all of these ideas about biolinguistics that I just claim that are taking shape right now go very much in line with what Evo-Devo is about and what the extended synthesis is about. So as a conclusion, we can say that biolinguistics might still have the same old questions in this agenda, but now the field is in practice so different from what has been done before that now and only now answers to these questions might actually start to take shape. And the abandonment of anthropo and genocentric perspectives and a focus on common underlying mechanisms between species and external factors bring linguistics within the fold of an extended synthesis in biology. And much like Evo-Devo represents a paradigm shift, or at least a big shift in biology, so does biolinguistics does for the study of language. So I think it seems that biolinguistics is not business as usual. Thank you.